Welcome to Fight Back Radio, production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggles. I'm your host, Richard Berg. Our guest today is the National President of the United Electric Radio and Machine Workers of America, UE as most people call it. The actual title is not National President, it's General President. But today we have General President Carl Rosen. And despite Carl's incredible modesty, he's a very zealous advocate for UE and for workers everywhere. You'll hear Carl in this interview give his incredible knowledge about labor history and particularly about the UE, and he'll combine it with his own experiences. And really, there's nobody that knows more about the UE than Carl Rosen, I don't believe. And you'll hear him, tell this unique story of a union that was, militant and fought and united, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers, but was also targeted by the rich, the 1%, in a vicious attack, but survived it. And so it's of the 13 unions that were targeted by McCarthyism. Only 2 have survived, and one of them is the UE, and they continue to do this good work today, and they operate as an example for the rest of the labor movement, I think. Also, I want to say about Carl Rosen, he has an amazing ability to unite a broad variety of forces in the fight, for dignity and rights for working people. And he does this not by compromising his principles or watering things down, but by educating people and talking to them, putting people in the room together that normally aren't in the room together, so that they can talk things through and they can unite to build a struggle for working people. And it's an ability that I wish more of us did have. So this, I think, is a special show, and I think you're going to enjoy it. If you want to reach Fight Back Radio, or you want to reach me, you can send an email to richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. Also, I want to encourage people, tell a friend to check out our podcast. We're growing at a good clip, but we want to keep growing, and we really, really depend on you. That's how we grow. Also, make sure that you like or subscribe and give us a positive review and those types of things. So with no more ado, here is Carl Rosen. So, welcome, Carl. Welcome to Fight Back Radio.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you, Richard.
Yeah, it's good to see you as well. So, Carl, I want to talk to you a little bit about the UE and how it's different from other unions, and it's had a different history and it operates a little bit different now. You talk about Them and Us somewhat. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, UE has a history going back to the foundation of the CIO in the 1930s. We were one of the founding unions, very much based on the idea of what we call Them and Us Unionism, now also referred to at times by some folks as class struggle unionism. It's basically the idea you know which side you're on. You know that the interest of the boss is not the same as the interest of the worker, and it's why workers need unions in order to represent their interests and understanding that fundamental dynamic and that it runs through all of the work that you do. And so that led to the unions that were formed in the 1930s largely were much more democratic, much more militant, much more likely to be to take in all workers within their industry. No discrimination based on sex or race or ethnicity or craft. Just fundamentally, we're all workers together. We all have a common interest. We need to stand up and fight together. And so that was UE's founding approach, and we've kept it throughout that time. Unfortunately, in the 1940s, there was a big split within the labor movement. Under pressure from capital, basically, and a combined press by forces within the government as well as major corporations, and that resulted in 13 unions, getting pushed out of the CIO, either quitting or being thrown out.
So let's back up a little bit. So the CIO is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is now today some people may have heard of the AFL-CIO.
Correct.
And that was a merger later on. but the CIO was different in some of the ways you're talking about, right? It was more, going to the lower sectors of the working class and such like that.
Sure. I mean, it was organizing factory workers, which up until that time, now people look at factory jobs as being relatively good in terms of pay and benefits when you compare it to large swaths of service sector jobs, for example. But at that time, the factory work was some of the worst jobs in the country. Long hours, really hard and dangerous work, and low wages. The reason it isn't anymore is because, in fact, the CIO unions were formed and organized in this great upsurge in which millions and millions of workers were organized during the 1930s into these industrial unions. And it's a large part of what pulled us out of the Great Depression. It's certainly what created, this whole period where what was called the American Dream was mythologized, essentially, of where people with jobs like this could earn enough to have a home, have cars, put their kids through college, etc. That all is an offshoot, or not an offshoot, a direct product of the organizing done by the CIO unions in the 1930s and carried into the 40s before the internal fights began.
And your union, United Electric, was not, as sometimes people think, electricians, but more factory workers that made appliances, things like that?
That's correct. We represented workers in companies like General Electric, Sylvania, Westinghouse, RCA, that made all kinds of electrical products. And so we were, like the auto workers were for the auto industry, we were the electrical workers for the electrical industry, and then the steel workers, for the steel industry. In fact, all three of our unions went on strike together in 1946, parallel at the same time as each other, with a similar demand to get back the pay that we'd basically lost during World War II, when there were wage price controls but not profit controls. And all these corporations had gotten much bigger and much more profitable. Workers had been left behind. That was an extremely strong, it was the closest there ever has been to a national general strike in this country, when you took down those three major industries at once. And it achieved its goals of really increasing wages for working people. But it scared the hell out of the capitalist class, and in a lot of ways, that's what there's a direct through line from that to the McCarthyite attacks on labor unions and the attempt to destroy unions being able to be as militant and stand up for the working class in general.
Well, let's dig into that just a little bit. So, I mean, I can see, my gosh, you're shutting down the richest people in the country right when they're trying to consolidate and expand their power around the world. So for UE in the building up to the strike in 1946 and then the aftermath, how did they actually, how did we have this great success, and then what did the attacks look like?
Well, the great success came from the organizing and the engaging workers in militant struggle through that whole period. I mean, the unions were not won easily during the 1930s. There were at times violent attacks, such as in Chicago with the Republic Steel Massacre, where people were shot dead just for being out, having
the strike at Little Steel you're talking about, the Memorial Day Massacre. Yeah,
exactly. Having peaceful protest and being shot dead by basically armed forces acting on behalf of the company, although paid by taxpayer dollars. There were tremendous number of important sit-down strikes where people occupied the plants as a way to make sure that scabs couldn't be brought in and the company couldn't, still be getting their product out the door. Very militant struggles. Workers who were engaged in that and engaged in that on a regular basis, they knew how to stand up for themselves, right? You have to exercise those muscles of militant action. If you don't, you can't expect it's just going to come out of nowhere. You've got to build up to that. So that had been going on now for the better part of a decade. But people had also, set it aside to some extent during World War II for the war effort to defeat fascism. It was necessary, but it resulted in a lot of pent-up demand, especially when they could see that these corporations had gotten absolutely giant and their coffers were full. And the workers were like, hey, we've been sacrificing for the last 5 years we'd like to get a fair share at this point. And so it was easy, relatively easy at that point, to get people engaged and willing to go out. And these were long strikes. These were, many weeks, months of strikes in 1946 in order to win. I think the demand was a 10-cent an hour pay raise, which doesn't sound like much now, but back then that was very significant. And they achieved their goals of getting a much better pay raise and setting the stage for more to come.
So at that time, UE was one of the largest unions in the country, right?
We had 600,000 members. I think we were the third largest union in the country.
Wow! And so then, working with the Steel Workers Union and the Auto Workers Union, you were able to exercise that kind of power. So the rich, or the 1%, the capitalists, whatever we call them here, were not happy after this moment, to say the least. And so they went after and attacked your union. What did that look like?
Well, it wasn't just our union. It was any union that wanted to stand up in a militant manner on behalf of their membership, and that had a broader view of what it meant to be a union. It wasn't just about bread and butter issues at an individual workplace, but it was about making gains on behalf of the working class. It was also about internationalism and standing in solidarity with workers in other countries who were, in many cases, fighting the same corporations. They went after all of us, and it was multi-pronged. A really important tool in it was the passage of Taft-Hartley, which limited basically looked at all of the things that worked best for labor unions and tried to take them away, such as sit-down strikes, for example, such as secondary boycotts. A lot of different things that unions did to support each other.
So this was a federal law that limited the laws that were passed in the 30s.
That's right. It basically reduced a lot of what had been won in the 1930s through the National Labor Relations Act. It also had in it loyalty oaths, which were completely unconstitutional, which said you couldn't be a leader of a union unless you swore an oath that you weren't a communist or supporter in some form or another. And then these were used for the witch hunts. And so the next level of tactic were these various McCarthyite committees that would come into a city where there was a big fight going on between a union and a corporation, maybe a major strike underway or something else, and they'd come in and they would literally subpoena the leadership of the union to come in and try and put them under the oath to swear whether it was true or not, or to demand that they name names or whatever else, and you were in a no-win situation, because if you said, which is exactly why this is unconstitutional, among other things, because the founders of our country realized that this was not a way to have a democracy. But because if you said, I'm not a communist and don't know communists or whatever else, they get somebody to come in and say, oh, I saw them at such and such a meeting, and now you're in trouble for perjury. And on the other hand, if you acknowledge you were, then the companies would use that as an excuse to fire you and to push you, or you wouldn't be allowed to hold union leadership or whatever else because of these loyalty oaths. So it was a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, and it tore a lot of people apart. And they used this very effectively, and they had support from other parts of society in it, and aspects of the church in different areas, etc. And it was very destructive, and so most of the unions in the CIO all of the unions in the CIO had to make a choice of which way would they go, and a few of them decided to accommodate and just said, okay, we're basically going to purge the left out of our unions and just make peace with industrial capital and just worry about our own members and not the bigger societal issues.
So the left in this case is people that are what you've held on to, this Them and Us Unionism, class struggle unionism.
That's right. And so, but like I said, 11 unions got destroyed in the course of that, just literally wiped off the map, no longer exist. One of the best ones was based here in Chicago, the Farm Equipment Union. There's a recent book about it that Tony Gilpin wrote that's well worth reading to really understand that era.
We'll put that in the show notes. I recommend Tony Gilpin's book as well. So yes, absolutely. But if you want to give a little teaser to
I'll move on. But parts of them actually ended up in my union, including the local I worked in was actually an old FE local, and there was a lot of really strong militant democratic stuff built into our contract and into our local constitution based off of that history. There were only two unions that survived that era that continued to stand up for internationalism, for democracy, for within the union movement, for a militant approach, for them and us understanding of what unionism was about. And that was UE and the West Coast Longshore Workers Union, which still exists, the International Longshore Workers Union, ILWU. And you can look down through the decades since then and see, we're the two unions that have, been kind of the shining light of the labor movement and the example that others in the labor movement who want to make a difference and want to have a fighting labor movement that can make a difference for the working class look to. And whether it's, our principled opposition to the Vietnam War when most of the labor movement was supporting it, our consistent standing up for the rights of immigrants, which was born in part out of the fact that throughout the 1950s and during the McCarthy era, the national government was trying to deport one of the national officers of both UE and the ILWU. Harry Bridges from the ILWU was from Australia originally, and Jim Matlis from UE, who was from Hungary originally. And they were straight up saying, we don't want them here because they're radicals and because of their political beliefs, even though, legally they were, they had naturalized or become citizens or whatever else. They were just like, we're going to throw them out because we don't like their political beliefs.
So let me, I want to move forward a little bit to what how UE is, how they're implementing this class struggle unionism today, and or even in the recent past. And maybe the place to start is at Kerr Glass, where you used to work. For when you started working with at Kerr Glass, maybe you can talk a little bit about your job, but also about how the union operated there, different than possibly other places.
Sure. So. Kerr Glass was a metal stamping plant, basically, on the southwest side of Chicago. About 120 workers on average, typically, so not a real big place, but enough that there was a good, solid leadership core, and just extremely democratic functioning. Took care of most of our own business. There was a national staff person assigned to work with us, but they didn't make any of the decisions for us. They didn't bargain our contracts. They would be there during bargaining to assist us with technical advice or maybe helping put leaflets together and that sort of thing. But we led our own bargaining at the table. Our elected committee, made up entirely of workers from the plant, and we carried on militant fights of all sorts while we were there. If people were upset, and word went out, people knew not to work overtime, and the company got the message real quick.
I bet they did.
We would get to contract time, and people would be geared up for the fight. There was a couple fairly substantial strikes in the late 70s into the early 80s there, but we were also very much involved in a lot of other social struggles going on. In the Chicago area, we were on the ground floor of helping found Jobs with Justice here, made up of some of the best elements in both labor and community that see the need for that kind of struggle. We had been involved in the strike solidarity, all the struggles in the late 80s, that were taking place throughout Illinois, and there was a Chicago area strike solidarity committee. We were tied into that. Our union was, always believed in independent politics, supported the Harold Washington movement, the independent political organizations that flowed out of that, rather than having, a city run by corporate interests, which was basically what the alternative was. And so on many levels, we continue to live what had been fought to have be put together in the 30s and 40s.
Well, let's talk about this a little bit. You raised a number of issues, but let's start with militant tactics. You had some strikes at Kerr Glass that had a militant edge to them, and it sounds like your leaders did not discourage this, which is sometimes the case, but actually were encouraging and helpful in providing resources. Also, I know there was a lot of discussion when Republic Windows and Doors was closing down or attempting to close down, and there was a sit down by the workers there, which were part of your union. Can you talk a little bit about militant tactics, either at Republic or Kerr or anywhere else you want to raise up?
I think you make a good point. What is the role of leadership and therefore also of staff when workers are at a point where they aren't going to win unless there's militant struggle? You can't follow the rules and win because the rules are written so that workers lose. I like to tell people, if you find the whole rule book, the last rule is workers lose. So we can't follow the rules. The rules are just like going back to the Taft-Hartley bill. That was written in order to cripple workers. If we were to follow all of it, that means we're not going to be able to have the power we need to have to win what we need to win. So very much in UE. The approach is to encourage members to think about all the possibilities of how they could fight and win. And, the leadership doesn't have a corner on what those best ways are. The workers know what it is at their workplace is most going to hurt the boss's ability to make a profit, to manage the place efficiently, whatever it is that is really going to, make the boss wake up and say, maybe I better address the workers' needs rather than deal with this problem. It's the workers who know that best. But where there's an opportunity to carry on a good fight, we always encourage that, and we try to think really creatively about how to make it successful. So like Republic Windows and Doors in 2008, when the whole economy was in free fall, at least the financial sector was, and the banks were getting bailed out, etc. And here we have and there were factories closing and other businesses closing all over the country with millions of people getting laid off. Nothing was being done for them, yet the banks were getting bailed out to tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. We realized we could play a role in helping shine a light on that, maybe win something for the workers, but also inspire others to do things too. And so we helped the workers at Republic Windows and Doors put together a plan to stop what was essentially a plant closing, where the equipment was being raided out of their plant and was going to be set up elsewhere on a non-union basis. And meanwhile, there was funding for it at that time from Bank of America, because they were the bank that had been lending money into the company, and we wanted them to step in and tell the company, either stop the closing or at the very least make sure that the workers get paid what they're due in a plant closing, because we could see the company was trying to basically just run away and leave the workers deserted. And we were able to. The workers had been through a number of fights over the previous years. They had actually been in a mobbed up union until 6-7 years before that, where they, and there's a section of these unions in this country. Unfortunately, they act like the Charro unions in Mexico, and they're there to suppress actual worker organization, not to help workers, take on the employer. Workers had fought their way out of that and come into UE, and they were extremely democratic because of that, because they knew what they didn't like, right? Mm-hmm. And they also were very willing to challenge management, and so we had regular battles to improve conditions, and we'd gotten significant pay raises for them, et cetera, and it made a real difference in their lives. So when they saw what was happening here and we put in front of them their options, they were ready to do a plant occupation, which essentially kept the assets of the company still in the building. So if those assets were going to be taken away, if they were going to be sold off or anything else, that money needed to come back to the workers in one form or another. And that was basically the basis on which people were staying there in that plant, it worked very effectively. We were able to frame it. This is where the saying, the banks got bailed out, we got sold out, came from. It started right here in this struggle. It didn't fully get picked up again until Occupy Wall Street started using it a few years later, about 3 years later. We were hoping it would have taken off sooner, but we're glad it did eventually. But it really focused the whole country on what was happening here to these 250 workers on Goose Island in Chicago. It led to the point where even Barack Obama, who was in transition to becoming president, then he got asked about it at a press conference, and he had to say, well, if these workers are owed money, then they're right. I mean, that's an amazing thing for workers who right then were occupying a plant, which was, under the laws of the U.S., not legal. This is one of the rules that, if you follow, you lose. And but if you're not going to follow, you better have a good strategy as to make sure that they aren't going to be able to do something that's going to severely hurt the workers due to it. And we had that because we were able to shine this public light on what was happening here. No police force was going to come in and drag out these workers who had been put in this position.
Let's talk a little bit about the solidarity because I know. Important UE is that they show solidarity with others, and I think at Republic that paid off because people. I remember I was with the Teamsters Union at that time, and I was in a meeting with some progressive Teamsters, and somebody called one of the people there and said, "Hey, look, UE just is doing a sit down at Republic Windows and Doors," and we were like, because you mentioned earlier this happened in the 30s, and some of us were aware of that, but it hasn't happened too much since the Taft-Hartley Act passed, and so this boldness, plus everybody there recognized who UE was, and that. This wasn't, a gimmick. This was something that they were doing that was important, and that and truthfully, everybody could say they've seen UE at the picket lines or working with Jobs with Justice, you've mentioned, or others. And so, could you talk a little bit about solidarity and how that helped you when it came back? And
Sure. Look, in the labor movement, we need to do solidarity, worker-to-worker solidarity, anywhere and everywhere we can. Because it's the right thing to do. It's because it's the only way as a class we can get ahead. We don't have the money. We don't have the control of government. What we have is people. And that's what solidarity is about, showing you've got the people, having enough people there, they can't stop you. So that's why we did it. We didn't do it because we felt someday we'll need it and we'll get that payback. Of course someday we'll need it, right? That's the point of solidarity. Everybody will need it at some point, but you do it because it's the right thing to do. And I think people did recognize that. So when the call went out, in fact, the plant occupation really started about 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And that evening was the annual dinner of the Illinois Labor History Society, where a lot of the best folks in the labor movement in Chicago gather. I would have been there, but I told them, sorry, I can't make it. This plant occupation is going on. Well, they announced it there, right? And of course, by the next morning, we had hundreds and hundreds of people coming in from all over Chicago and helping stand out front the doors of the building, which is the protection to make sure that the workers were going to be able to be successful with the plant occupation. You have to have that support of the community. You have to have been working with the community. I mean, that was one of the most important things in the 1930s in the building of the CIO, was the direct ties between workers' unions and workers' communities, right? It was seamless. And that's been lost largely. We need to rebuild that. We are in some places in this country. But, it's a lot harder for a lot of different reasons. But fundamentally, when unions under the pressure of the McCarthy era, those unions who turned towards a more business unionist orientation, one of the things they gave up by going to being bread and butter unions only at the workplaces, they stopped engaging in the struggles in the communities. So therefore, it's very hard to then go back later and ask the community to come out and support you. You haven't been engaged with them. I mean, it's very, very fundamental issues. And, working class communities, their issues are workers' issues. We do need to be engaged in it. And that's, one of the important things of what's now developing in some sections of the labor movement. You'll hear it in terms of bargaining for the common good and other things like that. And you certainly have seen it with the Chicago Teachers Union, where their issues, when they go into contract bargaining, when they engage in a fight with their employer, their issues are broad issues that address the needs of the whole working class community, not just what helps a particular group of teachers at a particular point, but what's going to lift up the community, what's going to help the community as a whole. And it's really, really important. We're really glad to see it. And they've said, the folks who have helped lead the renaissance of the Chicago Teachers Union as a fighting union, that they were inspired in part by Republic Windows and Doors. So again, these are things that do the right thing, lead the right kind of fights, act in the best kind of manner you can on behalf of the working class. Others will see it. Others will be motivated by it, see the examples, be able to carry these things on. And that's what we try to do in UE, and we're glad to see that more and more parts of the labor movement are doing that too.
Well, thanks for the kind words for the Chicago Teachers Union. Our listeners know that that's my union, and I'm a proud member of that. And I know that the feeling amongst the active members in the leadership of CTU towards UE is the same. Let me move to politics, electoral politics a little bit, because some of where you're talking about the community and the workplace spills over into when we're voting for people and how government works. And certainly there's been a lot of money has went into politics lately, which we try to match with people power and some of the things that you've just been talking about. So how does UE approach electoral politics? And I know, I'll say this too. I know I got to know some of the UE leaders best during the 90s when the Labor Party movement was bigger in the United States. And then following that, the UE endorsed Ralph Nader, which was, in the aftermath of Bush's election, maybe a little controversial. But can you talk about your approach and, how you look at electoral politics and what you do?
Sure. I mean, we're believers in what we call independent political action. In fact, that's one of the tenets of Them and Us Unionism. If anyone listening would like to, you can go to the UE website at ueunion.org, and you'll find a booklet that we put out just a couple years ago called Them and Us Unionism that lays out what we think are some of the main tenets of
and we'll put that in the show notes as well. So
okay, it lays out what we think are some of the important aspects of what it means to be a rank and file militant democratic union that's really standing up for the labor movement. By independent political action, we mean labor needs to be standing up for the working class. We can't rely on either of the existing political parties to do that. We very much believe that the slogan of Labor Party advocates and Labor Party from the 1990s, that the bosses have two parties, workers need to have one of their own. We have believed that throughout our history. We have supported the development of independent political formations for workers since our formation in the 1930s. There have been various attempts at it. What's interesting now is there are places where it's happening to some extent. I mean, I mentioned before we worked with Harold Washington, an independent political organization movement in Chicago. A piece of that has continued to exist since that period in the 1980s in terms of the IPO of the 22nd Ward, which I'm happily a member of, and that's the home base for Chuy Garcia, the great congressman from the 4th Congressional District, and numerous other folks who've been standing up on behalf of a very working class, probably the most union membership district in the entire city. So we're seeing a lot more of that. And, you have the development of United Working Families, for example, here in Chicago, which is knitting together various IPOs around the city, along with unions that recognize we need to have our own voice as workers, and that's independent of either of the political parties. It doesn't mean we don't work within the Democratic Party at times at this point. There doesn't seem, at one time, there were also attempts to work within the Republican Party. That seems to be pretty much a lost cause now. But there's clearly a major fight going on within the Democratic Party. We endorsed Bernie Sanders in his presidential runs. That's the first time in UE's history that we made an endorsement within the Democratic Party primary for president, just because we've felt, that this is not an area where the working class has real influence. But what Bernie brought to the table and what he was able to mobilize, and the way he stood for exactly all of the correct issues that we advocate for, we felt that it was important that we do that, and that fight now continues within the Democratic Party. So, there's an inside-outside strategy here. We need to build our own structures, but in some places, Chicago is a single-party town, a one-party town, really, right? The Republican Party barely exists here. What that means is that all the different political tendencies are within the Democratic Party here. So there's people within the Democratic Party here who are basically Republicans in a lot of ways, right? But at the other wing, there's people who are, socialists and, different left-thinking outlooks. And so that's playing out in these. In fact, in a lot of times, they are nonpartisan elections for aldermen, for mayor, etc. So you don't really have to declare a party in the same way. So this plays out in a lot of different ways. But we need to be standing up for our issues. We need to expect that people that we actually endorse and support, they'll really are going to fight for the working class, fight to support unions, and then the other thing that's an independent political action is, you fight around the issues. If we're only doing stuff at election time, we're in trouble. We've got to be fighting for the issues we need year-round, whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's proper education funding. You name it. Those are things we should be fighting for all the time, and not just electing somebody and expecting them to take care of us.
And that goes back to connecting the communities, right?
Absolutely.
And with the workplace, because it's whether you're a union or not, whether you work, wherever you work, if you're in a working class community, you need health care, and we need to all. Then that goes to solidarity, I guess. So
that's absolutely right.
So let me go back to solidarity a little bit, because it goes beyond our borders as well, and unions. We started out early in this conversation talking about the post-World War II, and during World War II, unions were very united against fascism around the world and to fight against Hitler. But in more recent times, at least in the United States, unions have, if you're a union member, you may not even know that if your union's involved in national politics or international politics. And UE is actually went out of its way to try to make some different ties and to publicize them, not just amongst its members, but even to others as well, and to try to bring this kind of thing in. So could you talk about how you look at international solidarity, and why you're working with the unions around the world that you are?
Sure. Internationalism is a key tenet of Them and Us Unionism. When you understand that it's workers against the corporate class, that's not just workers in the U.S. The workers in other parts of the world are facing a lot of the same corporations, certainly the same corporate agendas as we are, and it's at our own peril that we don't practice really deep solidarity with the folks elsewhere. It was that failure. Basically, part of the deal that was cut in the 1940s amongst those unions that decided, we'll just concede and play by the rules they want to set for us rather than fight back. Part of what they conceded was that they would have no influence on U.S. foreign policy, that they would not challenge what was going on whatsoever, and there'd be no independent labor voice on it. And what that meant is U.S. foreign policy became a tool to make the world safe for American corporations to go out and exploit people elsewhere, which also meant the offshoring, eventually, of most American manufacturing, which really undercut tremendously the labor movement that was allowing this to happen without challenging it. And so it really led to the situation where then, in the 1980s, Reagan could do an all-out assault on the labor movement because it had been so weakened by then, between the influence of business unionism and the lack of militant fighting and the fact of so many jobs being moved overseas, etc. And so we didn't challenge that all of these corrupt regimes were being allowed to bring in millions of jobs that had been in our country and just cruelly repress workers in those countries who did not want to be working in those substandard conditions, wanted to be standing up and fighting back, but literally would get killed for it. And just extreme repression, or in many cases, very corrupt unions, and they aren't really unions, like the Charro unions in Mexico, their protection rackets would be put in place. And that would result in also workers being held down. And so we had to break through that. And UE, especially starting in the late 80s into early 90s, as this whole agenda of how this was really undercutting American workers was becoming clearer and clearer. And we were coming into the period where they passed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act, which had the double whammy of wiping out the agriculture industry in Mexico, displacing millions of poor farmers who then had to go find a job somewhere, combined with making it a lot easier to set up American factories, U.S. factories in Mexico. So that double whammy was coming. It was at a time that there was starting to be some focus of attention on imports, but in exactly the wrong way, so that Japanese cars that were coming in here, the union involved here, instead of trying to figure out how to work in solidarity with the unions of those workers in Japan, and they were unionized, instead were making big promotions of having people take sledgehammers and attack these cars and vilifying the workers in other countries rather than figuring out how to stand in solidarity. So part of how we broke through that was through worker-to-worker exchanges. So we had General Electric, which was our major employer at the time. We had a national contract with. They were offshoring a lot of the jobs from this country. And it made the workers in this country very angry. They read the same mainstream press that tried to just vilify workers elsewhere for being willing to work for so little, etc., without necessarily fully understanding it until we started these worker-to-worker exchanges where we would take workers from a unionized factory here in the U.S. that we represented and bring them to Mexico and have them meet with workers who were trying to organize but also facing tremendous repression in these factories. And they could see now that this was not the workers' fault, this was GE's fault. GE was creating these conditions. And it made a huge difference in terms of being able to get people to understand why the fight needed to be in solidarity, internationalism, with the workers in these other countries, not attacking them. And we had to help them lift up their standards. And we developed what we called a strategic organizing alliance with the FAT, which is an independent union, one of the few in Mexico at that time. That fortunately right now, because of the struggles over the last 30 years that UE and a few other forward-thinking unions have been supporting in Mexico, they were able to fight, and they got the labor laws changed there, and now there's actually, you can read about it every few weeks. There's another election there where workers are throwing out the old corrupt Charro union and bringing in a new independent union and fighting for better contracts there. That's what we need, but it's been a long slog. And it also ties into our views towards immigrants. I mean, immigrants come here in large measure because wherever they're living right now has been destroyed. People don't just leave their home country just for the fun of it. They do it because things have been really hurt, whether it's by war or by climate change, destroying their ability, or it's in many cases these bad trade deals which have forced economic destruction on their countries. And they go to someplace they think they can get a job. And we have an obligation at that point to help organize them, not to vilify them.
Yeah, let me ask you about, I want to move to some of the work UE's doing here in the United States. And our podcast goes across the country, and so I know there's different places, especially organizing the unorganized. I know that you've had success in the rail industry. You've had success recently at MIT, the elite university in Boston, and Gatorade. I read something on your website. Maybe you could talk a little bit about organizing and what those campaigns look like and how that's worked out for you in UE.
Yeah, this is a really important and exciting time for the labor movement. Workers are fed up, particularly younger workers, people who've come of age in the last 20 years into the labor force. They have seen declining returns from whatever jobs that they're working. They are not getting the kind of jobs that they'd expected to coming out of school. They are feeling very much that they have a lower standard of living than their parents' generation did, yet at the same time they're seeing the corporations are richer than ever before. The very wealthy individuals are way richer than ever has happened before, and they are recognizing that the system is not working for them, and nobody is going to come and fix it for them. Nobody in the government is going to fix it for them. They've got to fix things themselves, and the way they do that is by unionizing and developing the power to force the employer to provide for them better than it is. And so you're seeing that in all kinds of upsurges, whether it's what's happening in some Amazon warehouses, Starbucks, etc., but also in many other places. And then also the pandemic has contributed to that workers realize this is life or death for them, and they're not going to continue to put up with what they did before. So we've had a lot of organizing success in UE coming off of this. You mentioned Gatorade. It's a Gatorade bottling plant called Refresco in New Jersey, largely immigrant workforce. That organizing started right at the height of the pandemic, when workers were being deceived by management, it felt like, in terms of whether people certainly not being told by management what was going on in terms of people who had COVID or not in the plant. They were just trying to make them keep working no matter what, and this was before the vaccines or anything else, so people were at high risk. They actually did a walkout in the midst of that, and started to feel their power because they ended up all going back to work. In fact, the walkout started because it looked like a worker was getting fired for, saying, hey, we need to be treated better. And what happened instead is after they all walked out together, it was a supervisor who ended up going out the door rather than that worker. And so, they started to feel their power, the pandemic got in the way of getting to an election, but we've gotten to it. Unfortunately, the company got the labor board to run the election a second time over a small technicality in terms of something the labor board did. We just got through that. They just voted by a good margin, and we've just got certified there for a couple hundred workers at that plant, which is great, and we'll be going into first contract negotiations there. But we can also see it in graduate workers organizing. Folks who in the past would have felt like, while I'm in graduate school, this is just a stepping stone. I'm going to have a whole well-paid experience coming ahead of me once I get through this. If I have to take on some debt right now or live in not great situation, I can survive for a few years. They're now recognizing the path into academia is a lot narrower now because of the corporatization of universities and reduction in the number of tenured faculty, et cetera, and much more use of adjuncts, et cetera. And also they're saying there's a lot more money in these universities, but it's not coming to the graduate workers. It's going into administration and other places, and they're fed up too. And they're, again, of this younger generation that has grown up realizing you're only going to get what you fight for. And so, we first had workers come to us, and UE has some history in higher ed organizing at the University of Iowa, which we organized back in the mid 1990s.
New Mexico,
and so recently, both New Mexico State and University of New Mexico have organized into UE. They're in first contract bargaining, and then this huge win at MIT. It's almost 4,000 graduate workers. There's almost another 1,000 who are going to be organizing in there next, and we're going to be starting first contract negotiations there soon. And we won it by a very substantial 2-to-1 margin. Just a great victory. And again, bottom-up organizing. It's the workers organizing themselves because they realize that's what they need. So we're really happy to see all of that going on. And another piece we've been working on that helps on this upsurge, we believe, is the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which is a project that UE started along with DSA. It actually came out of the Bernie Sanders campaign, where we were, seeing workers reaching out as the pandemic was really gripping workplaces. What do? They didn't have a union. They didn't have time to organize a union. They needed relief right now. They needed whatever it was, whether it was masks or time off for being sick or hazard pay for being in there, etc. And so what the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, EWOC, does is basically it's a way people can reach out and be connected to volunteers. It's a whole network of volunteers across the country, distributed organizing, the model that came out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. People who will give you advice as to what your rights are, how you can talk to your fellow workers, how you can make a demand on the boss to fix things, how you can take it out into the media and the community if need be. And if you get a good enough grouping of people in leadership, maybe you can turn it into a union drive and you can be connected to an existing union to help you with that. Or if you want to organize independently, you can do that too, which is what we're seeing, for example, in Amazon, for example, where the Amazon Labor Union has organized themselves from the bottom up. So all of these different, and even where the way we look at it is, even where it doesn't result in a union drive, it results in some workers who now understand what their rights are and how to organize. And even if it doesn't pay off in whatever particular workplace they are right now, they're going to get to other workplaces where maybe it will. And we kind of look at the history in the 30s. That didn't just come out of the blue. There were folks working very hard throughout the 1920s to educate folks about what needed to be done in terms of building industrial unionism. And so that led to a large enough number of people knowing which end was up going into the 1930s, that when the situation developed where people could stand up and organize, they knew how to do it.
No, that's absolutely true. And my hat's off to UE, skilling up our workers and raising consciousness. Some of I just read about the Trade Union Education League in the 1920s, which laid the groundwork, in my view, for some of what happened in the 30s. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time here. I want to give you an opportunity, if there's anything else that you want to add about your union or about the labor movement in general. I'll say to our listeners, some of these first contracts that are being negotiated right now at UE are going to be tough, because they always are. So if you're in Boston, where MIT is, or New Jersey, where the Gatorade company, I forgot what the name, Refresco, keep your ears open for if UE does put out a call for help. We want Fight Back Radio listeners to respond to that, and or New Mexico or wherever, and not just UE, any union people, we want them to respond to and support. We need to stand together. That's our power. But is there anything you'd like to add, Carl?
No, I think that's really it. Thank you so much for that pitch for solidarity for UE, for members of UE, workers who are standing up and fighting. We do always appreciate that. Folks can go to our website and you can get linked there to our Facebook and Twitter pages so that you can follow what's going on. When we have rallies and other events, we always post them there. And so you can know what we're involved in, and we just hope to see people out in the streets. That's where we need to be.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Carl. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. There's so much there. If you're new to organized labor, let me tell you, this is the way unions are supposed to operate. And Carl gave us a lot to think about there. If you've been in the labor movement for a long time, you're not going to find a better example than UE and the things that Carl talked about that they do and how they do things there. And there's so much that we can learn from the United Electric Workers. As I promised, we're going to give you in the show notes, we'll give you the webpage for the UE, which is ueunion.org. We're also going to put in there, I mentioned Tony Gilpin's book about the Farm Equipment Workers Union. It's called The Long Deep Grudge, A Story of Big Capital, Radical Labor, and Class War in America's Heartland. And it's a good book. I recommend it. And it talks about this, what Carl was alluding to there with the UE for a while. The FE had the same thing, but they didn't survive like the UE did. So look to the show notes for that information. Also, we'll include our contact information, how you can reach us, Twitter, Instagram, all those things. But I want to tell people again, please tell your friends about this. This is you just heard the interview with Carl. Others should too, and so please pass the word and tell folks to check out Fight Back Radio. If you want to reach us, you can drop me a note at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And until next time, will be 2 weeks from now. But let me also thank our great production team of Vince Olson and Shane Tremley. None of this happens without them. And so thank you all. And for our entire Fight Back Radio team, I'm Richard Berg, saying until next time, all power to the people.